Good afternoon, Rotarians, guests, faculty, students, and supporters of the University of Michigan-Flint. It is a pleasure to be here with you today as we welcome the first economic forum in person for the last couple of years here. So I know we've had a chance to convene before on Zoom over the last few years, but it's wonderful to be able to be here with many of you in person today, as well as to welcome several folks from Zoom as well. My name is Elizabeth Jordan. I have the pleasure of being the president of the Rotary Club of Flint this year, and what a wonderful way to be part of this as we head back to the Economic Forum in person. So as we begin our Rotary meetings, we often start off with the Pledge of Allegiance, and so we'll do that today. If you care to stand, if you're able to, I welcome you to do so. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And as Rotarians, we try to model good professional ethics as well as excellence and service. And so we use what we call the four-way test as the guide to that. So we say, of the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? So our program today, of course, focuses on economics and is going to, I'm sure, invite us in many ways to envision what the future year may look like. The theme of our Rotary year is actually Imagine Rotary. And so I'm going to invite up Anne-Marie Van Dyne, who is our president-elect. So she'll be at the podium here next year to give our inspirational message.
Good afternoon. This is a wonderful Flint Rotary tradition. This past week, my family said goodbye to our matriarch, celebrated her beautiful and exceptional life of 88 years. And just this past Wednesday, as many of you know, our community lost an incredible servant and leader, Bryant Nolden. Unlike Gloria, Beebe's death was sudden, unexpected, and a shock to all of us. We are grief-stricken. We have been abruptly reminded of time, how much time we have, how much time we've been gifted. Everyone in this room knows that time, the management of it, the effective use of it, it's a frequent topic of business commentators and consultants. In fact, just yesterday, the subject line of an arts leadership blog that I received featured a republished article from the Harvard Business Review titled, "Why Should You Make Time for Self-Reflection, Even If You Hate Doing It?" I have reflected more often in these past several days on the time I've been gifted. Time to make big plans and accomplish important projects. As a Rotarian, time to imagine a different world and take action. Time, gosh, this time of year, there's just never enough of it. I think we all agree that time is a precious commodity, a great unrenewable resource. Yet as much as we try to manage it, the time we've been given is ultimately beyond our control. So after self-reflection and in honor of Beebe's memory, I've shared this. Take the time to smile more often, to greet strangers warmly, to open the door, carry the package, check in on a neighbor, to write that note, to express your feelings, to turn off the news, turn on some music, to read to a child, to take a walk, to listen carefully, to remember and cherish fond memories, to give more hugs, to count one's blessings, express gratitude, take time to be silent, to pray, to worship each day. In memory of Bibi, may you be blessed to take the time.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That incredibly timely and fitting and very appropriate. So thank you. So one of the things that I didn't want to assume that everybody in the room necessarily knows about Rotary. Probably everybody who's here today probably is very familiar with the University of Michigan, Flint. But I want to share a little bit of background about Rotary for those of you who may not be as aware. So Rotary is an international network of 1.4 million friends, neighbors, and leaders who give of their skills and of their talents and of their resources to help solve problems and address community needs. Rotary is devoted to causes that build international relationships and that improve lives and communities here and around the globe. We do this through promoting peace, fighting disease and preventing polio, providing clean water, sanitation, and hygiene, saving mothers and children, supporting education, growing local economies, and also protecting the environment. Our local club here in Flint started in 1916, and so for more than 100 years, Rotarians have been making a difference in our community as well as around the world. As an example, we have 2 service projects next week, and I'm so excited because we already have people signing up, even though the notice just went out yesterday of the opportunity, that we're going to be packing holiday boxes at the food bank at 10 o'clock on Monday, and then on Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, we have some folks involved with our literacy project who are going to be selecting and packaging books for kids in our own community who need access to books. And so those are just some very quick examples of when we hear there's a community need, Rotarians can be called upon to help to fulfill that as well. And then we've also done a lot of international work. So our club here in Flint, we do things like contribute towards the shelter box initiative. So when you heard about the horrendous flooding in Pakistan that displaced hundreds of thousands of people, shelter box and Rotarians were involved in helping to meet needs like that. So Rotary is a way to give, whether it's your time, your treasure, in ways that really benefit our community and the globe. I want to just take a brief moment to offer another late-breaking announcement. Judge Duncan Beagle is a longstanding Rotarian, and as many of you know, he will be retiring. And so for those of you that want to celebrate Duncan Beagle and his retirement, my understanding is there is a gathering this Thursday at Fouch's at 5 o'clock. So I think Kyle McCree has details on that if you need any further information. But thank you for that little detour there. I thought that's an important framing as we talk about the Economic Forum and this truly wonderful partnership with the University of Michigan Flint. Understanding the economic context is so very important as we try to do good in the world and our own communities. The economy affects so much from people's daily lives, certainly from businesses and small businesses, but also all of us as consumers, as people who are looking for housing or seeking jobs. And so I really appreciate the time and the expertise that we're going to have to enjoy today through our panel. And so I would like to first introduce and welcome Interim Dean of the School of Management, Dr. Yaner Kandigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our campus. Welcome to the annual Economic Forum. Every second Friday of December, we get together here to look back at the economy and discuss macroeconomic, financial, and global developments and talk about what's ahead of us in the new year. This annual tradition began 15 years ago as the initiative of Dr. Jack Helmut, then Dean of the School of Management, my former boss, now dear friend, Professor of Finance and a Rotarian, with collaboration with the Rotary Club of Flint. It's become an event that I look forward to every year. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Helmut to the podium for the introduction of the panelists.
Thank you, Yaner. Welcome to the 15th Annual Economic Forum, sponsored between the School of Management and the Rotary Club. 15 years, quite a run. When we've seen a lot of good economic news and some not so good. So we're going to find out today what lies in store for the future. But again, it's our pleasure to welcome everybody, the Rotarians and students and the people from our city here to our campus for this event. Our panel will provide ample proof that economics is not the dismal science. And again, we have an excellent panel. At the end of their presentations, at that point, we will go ahead and entertain some questions, Q&A, okay, which is always also a kind of a highlight of the event. For those of you who are attending live here at our historic, this historic building, we have 5x7 cards. So at the end of the presentations, if you have questions, go ahead and write them up. We'll collect the 5x7 cards. For those of you who are zooming in, there is a link to, please don't send your questions to the chat. There is a link for a person Q&A. Okay, so please send the questions to Q&A. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. Dr. Christopher Douglas, Professor of Economics, who has presented at all 15 now of our forums. Chris is the Department Chair of Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Michigan College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Yenner Kandogan, my boss, Professor of International Business and Interim Dean of the School of Management, and also Faculty Associate, Center for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies at our sister campus, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Okay, and then our third panelist returning is Steve Chinenko, MBA, former Chief Investment Risk Officer, Nationwide Insurance. So again, an excellent panel, and I'm just anxious to hear about the future, and we're going to have Chris start. Chris Douglas will be the first speaker.
So thanks for that nice welcome, Jack. It's been great to be here for 15 years. It's been an interesting 15 years, as I've remarked. I started in 2007. It's just been one crisis after another. You know, the Great Recession, slow recovery. We have a couple good years, and then COVID, and now inflation. So it's an interesting time to be an economist, I suppose. So today I just want to talk about, hey, what's 2022 looking like? I think it's a pretty mixed bag this year. And then, hey, what might 2023 look like? I can't tell you that, because 2023 is going to depend on what inflation looks like, and then how the Federal Reserve responds, and then throw some geopolitical risks into the mix. So I could just kind of give you a few scenarios of what I think 2023 will be like, but that's kind of the best I could do. So here's a summary slide. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. This just might be helpful for people who watch this presentation later. I'm going to cover these bullet points in my remarks moving forward. So first, this is a graph of gross domestic product, which is GDP, total value of all final goods and services produced in the economy. Growth on that is what we mean by economic growth. Economic growth was strong in 2022, so that's good. So I'm going to do the whole Harry Truman two-handed economist thing, because on the one hand, economic growth was good. The other hand, total production of goods and services, which is the red line, GDP, still is below trend. So trend is the blue line. Trend is what's called potential GDP. It's what production of goods and services would be if the economy was really firing on all cylinders. So GDP right now is about $200 billion below trend. So $200 billion fewer goods and services are being produced right now compared to if the economy was operating properly, if you will. That's a real problem, because production of goods and services is how income is generated. So there's $200 billion less in income in the economy as a result of GDP being below trend. That comes out to be about $1,000 per US adult. So on average income is about $1,000 less per US adult, thanks to GDP being below trend. And as you can see from the graph, GDP goes way below trend during the Great Recession a dozen years ago. It takes the better part of 10 years for it to get back to trend. Someone remarked that my remarks are always negative at these things, and kind of looking back, I'm like, well, you look at that graph of how long GDP was below trend, that's kind of a problem. Very slow recovery following that Great Recession. GDP only gets back to trend for really a hot second around 2018, 2019, before going way below trend again, thanks to the shutdowns. The unemployment rate, hey, that looks pretty good, 3.7% compared to what we've seen historically, of course. If you look at total employment, total number of jobs in the economy, here's by two-handed economists again, because on the one hand, job growth was strong this year. All the jobs lost during COVID have been returned, which is good because COVID, the shutdowns really, wipes out the better part of 20 years worth of job gains. The problem is, on the other hand, that if you look at the trend of job creation, had COVID not happened, had the economy not shut down in response to COVID, job growth would have continued. So if you kind of like just trace out, I don't have a laser pointer, but if you just kind of trace out that blue line, assuming no big decrease in employment, we would be about 3 million jobs higher in the economy compared to where we are right now. So total employment in the economy still is about 3 to 3.5 million jobs below trend. We still, like with GDP, haven't got back to where we would have been had things not shut down in 2020. The consumer price index, changes in the consumer price index is what we mean by inflation. You can see inflation is running at a 40-year high right now. It's probably the story of 2022. You can kind of see at the tail end of that graph that inflation is coming down a little bit. It dropped from about 8.3% to 7.7% in the most recent inflation report that was released last month. That's good. Certainly it would be nice if inflation comes down, but that's just one inflation report. One data point doesn't make a trend. It remains to be seen if inflation continues to fall. Inflation reports are released, I believe it's the second Tuesday of every month. So the next inflation report will be released next week, Tuesday. It's going to be really key to see if inflation further fell in November or if inflation ticks back up again. Because we've had other false starts where we thought inflation was falling. The next inflation report comes out and it's like, actually, inflation surged again. I kind of remember, I think it was last summer, Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winning economist who writes in the New York Times, wrote a column that said, well, I think inflation is over, something along those lines, and then inflation shoots right back up again. So there's also this story in 2022 that inflation is being driven by the increase of the price of crude oil thanks to the Russian-Ukrainian war, that if that war didn't happen, inflation would have fallen. That view is not accurate, because if you look at what's called the core consumer price index, the consumer price index absent food and energy prices, according to the core consumer price index, inflation is still at a 30 or 40-year high. The core consumer price index, even if you subtract out energy prices, inflation is still running at 6.3%. So overall inflation, 7.7%. Core inflation, absent food and energy prices, 6.3%. So probably oil prices have added a percentage point to a percentage point and a half to the rate of inflation, but it can't explain why inflation ran at about 8% this year. A problem with inflation is probably everyone knows, wages haven't been keeping up with inflation. I don't know about you, but I did not get an 8% pay increase this year. Lots of people didn't, which means that adjusted for inflation, wages fell by about 3% this year, which means people's purchasing power fell by 3%. That's a real problem, obviously, if you can't buy as many goods and services as you could the previous year. And it's also a problem because, as you can see from this graph is a graph of how weekly wages are changing year to year. The change in wages being negative this year wipes out, five pretty solid years of wage growth. Okay, so in terms of inflation, how did we get here? Well, we could say a couple of things have happened. First, everyone knows the supply shocks, supply chain issues during COVID, computer chip shortages. We know that because of Michigan, that pushes up the prices of goods that use those inputs of the production process. The increase of the price of crude oil makes everything that uses oil as an input more expensive. So certainly these supply shocks have caused prices to rise, but that can't explain, in my view at least, the persistent inflation that we're seeing. Because if inflation was just due to supply chain issues, you would just see the prices of those goods rising, but not the price of everything else, including services. But you're seeing the price of everything else, including services, surge as well, which is why I think inflation is really coming from the demand side of the economy. Because if you think about how much money was spent on COVID stimulus over the last 2 years, it's just mind-blowing, at least in my view. About $5 trillion was spent over 3 rounds of COVID stimulus. To put $5 trillion in perspective, that's a full $1 trillion more than what was spent to fight World War II adjusted for inflation. As long as I've been alive, people worry about Social Security having a funding shortfall. Social Security can't pay out promised benefits. How big is that funding shortfall? The last number I saw, about $5 trillion, which means if you took the money just spent on COVID stimulus over the last 2 years and threw it at Social Security would have been solvent forever. Another way to think about how big a trillion is, 1 billion seconds is 32 years. 1 trillion is 1,000 billion. So 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years. So 5 trillion seconds, that's about 150,000 years. If you want to count to 5 trillion, 1 second at a time, it's going to take you 150,000 years. That's longer than human civilization has been around for. So if you think about how that stimulus was financed, where did the government come up with $5 trillion? Well, the Federal Reserve just printed that out of thin air, dumped it into the economy, and consumers tried to spend it. And what we've known since Milton Friedman's time and before is if you just dump all this newly printed money in the economy and people try to spend it, that's going to cause inflation to surge. It really does blow my mind that inflation just caught a good chunk of the economics profession and apparently the Federal Reserve totally off guard. Didn't catch me off guard, I expected this, of course, but caught lots of other people off guard. So to further my point that inflation is being driven by the demand side through money creation, here's a graph of the money supply, currency in circulation plus checking deposits. It's a slight increase in the money supply over the last 2 years. It's only doubled from about $3 trillion to over $7 trillion. So what a shock. You look at a graph like that and yeah, inflation's a problem at the same time. I think it was Milton Friedman who said, the average American would be surprised that the board of the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, which is the 12 individuals who set monetary policy, could just wake up one day and vote to double the money supply. He said that tongue in cheek, and that's what happened over the last 2 years. Okay, so what's the way out to wrap up my remarks here? I'm probably going long. So I'm gonna give you 3 scenarios I think that are about equally likely for 2023. Good case scenario, bad case scenario, and I guess 2 bad case scenarios. So the good case scenario, call this a soft landing or immaculate disinflation as sometimes it's called. This just means inflation comes back down to normal, 2% or so, without anything bad happening. Maybe I'm overstating the demand causes of inflation. I don't think I am, but I could be wrong. Maybe inflation really is due to supply chain issues. Assuming the supply chain doesn't get further disrupted, prices will rise to reflect the new supply chain reality. But once that happens, prices will stop rising. And if prices stop rising, that means inflation slows, which is an important point because when you talk about inflation slowing, all that means is prices stop rising. It does not mean prices come back down to where they were before the pandemic. Even if inflation is due to the demand side, which is what my view is, if you look at what's called the quantity theory of money that helps win Milton Friedman the Nobel Prize, quantity theory of money says if you do a big increase in the money supply, yeah, that causes a big burst of inflation, but assuming that big increase in the money supply doesn't continue to happen on a permanent basis, well, then inflation won't happen on a permanent basis. Yeah, you inject a bunch of newly printed money in the economy, prices rise, but then once that newly printed money works its way through the system, prices stop rising, which means inflation slows. So that's a possibility for what will happen, causing inflation to come back down without something bad happening. But that assumes really no more policy mistakes. My view, at least, is the last 2.5 years plus, it's just been one policy mistake after another. So what's the worst case scenario? Worst case scenario is we have a severe recession in 2023. And that is inflation turns out to be pretty persistent, which means the Federal Reserve continues to hike up interest rates by, say, 75 basis points per month. Well, if the Federal Reserve hikes interest rates aggressively, something's going to break eventually. But what's probably going to break is the housing market, in my view, as well as the stock market. Because if you push up interest rates, asset prices tend to come back down. For the simple reason that A higher interest rate on, say, a mortgage makes a house more unaffordable. So what happens is housing prices adjust down to compensate. And if you do like a quick calculation about, hey, what would the monthly payment or what would the price of a house have to be right now at a 6% interest rate so that the monthly payment is the same as what it was a couple of years ago when the interest rate was 3%, housing prices would have to fall by, say, 25 to 30% in order to keep that monthly payment unchanged in the face of that higher interest rate. Well, that's a real problem because when housing prices fell by 20% during the Great Recession, that caused a massive financial crisis. People found themselves underwater on their mortgages. If you think about how crazy the housing market was, people just going through these crazy bidding wars, wouldn't take a whole lot for housing prices to come down to push those people underwater on their mortgages. Mortgage-backed securities went bust a dozen years ago when housing prices fell by 20%. That's a possibility that that could happen again. Banks would face insolvency problems if that happened. So basically the worst case scenario is, well, you get a repeat of that 2008-09 financial crisis, but the Federal Reserve couldn't bail everyone out again. That's how the financial crisis ended last time. Federal Reserve just bailed everyone out. Well, in this case, the Federal Reserve couldn't bail people out because the Federal Reserve would be the ones causing it. So third scenario is stagflation. Stagflation just says, well, look at scenario number 2, the Federal Reserve sees things breaking and the Federal Reserve blinks. They stop raising interest rates and maybe they start cutting interest rates, which means inflation never gets solved. Inflation continues to run hot, that's deflation, but then you get economic stagnation on top of that. And that's what the 1970s was like. And it took the better part of 10 to 15 years to fix that. So worst case scenarios, we see that round number 2. So I will be hoping for the immaculate disinflation myself. So if that said, that's what I've got. I will turn the microphone over to Jenner and I look forward to taking your questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I wanted to mention to the audience, both live and Zoom, is that the PowerPoint slides of all the panelists will be on the School of Management website. And then within the next few days, the Rotary Club will go ahead and have the YouTube version of what our presentations here today. So we will have the YouTube link also on our School of Management website. So look for both the PowerPoints and within a few days, the YouTube. My pleasure to introduce Dr. Ken Dogan.
Thanks, Jack. Are we heading in for a global recession? The likelihood that we are is high. That is at least what the leading indicators of gross domestic product are telling us. Purchasing Managers Index, when larger than 50, it denotes expansion, is below 50 for United Kingdom, Euro, and China, slightly better for the United States, while Brazil and India are expected to have an expansion. The trend is also very important. While US, Brazil, and India are above 50 now, they are all been declining. The other 2 leading indicators of gross domestic product also suggests more or less the same. Consumer sentiment, business sentiment in every large economy, developing or developed, have been declining and are many standard deviations below 0. Consumer sentiment is worse in the United Kingdom. Japan and Euro are well above average, best in the US and Brazil. Business sentiment, on the other hand, is worse in the United States, and it looks like businesses in the US are now feeling the same optimism as consumers. Business sentiment is slightly below average in the United Kingdom, above average in Japan and Euro area. When we look at the growth forecast for emerging countries, we see declines are sharp. Developed countries, we see declines are sharper than expected. World is expected to have the weakest growth profile since 2001, except the global financial crisis and the pandemic. On average, advanced economies' growth rate is expected to drop from 5.2% in 2021 to 2.4% this year and 1.1% in next year. Europe is certainly the area in greatest trouble. Euro area is expected to have a very weak growth. Several EU countries, such as Germany and Italy, are expected to be in recession next year. In the United States, growth rate is expected to be 1.6% this year and down to 1% the following year. The situation is not entirely different for emerging countries. We see declines in growth rates in general. from 6.6% to 3.47%. Some are worse hit, such as Russia, Brazil, Mexico, and emerging Europe. ASEAN countries are faring well, as well as Saudi Arabia. The picture is marginally less pessimistic when it comes to China, with weak growth in 2022, 3.2% growth in 22. Things are looking a little bit better in 23 at 4.4%, but of course these are much lower than what China is used to in terms of growth rates. Middle East and North Africa region look to set perform well, not surprising given where the energy prices currently are. Cost of living increases, tightening financial conditions in every region of the world, war in Ukraine, and the lingering pandemic all weigh heavily on these forecasts. I'm going to look at each one of these next. An important threat to global economy is inflation. Every country is experiencing cost of living increases. The source was supply chain problems at first, driven by the pandemic lockdowns and lingering lockdowns in China. This is evident from higher price increases in core goods in comparison to services at first. This is the case in both advanced and emerging economies. While prices continue to increase in services, note that the price increases in goods is coming down, particularly in advanced economies. Chip prices, lumber prices, steel, copper prices, these were all in the news in early 2022. We do not talk about these right now. Prices have come down 10, 15, 20%, some cases 60% from the highs we have seen earlier. Global environment is where it is today, initially because of the COVID lockdowns and the impact on the supply of raw materials, and now because of the war and the impact on supply of energy and food. Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues to destabilize the global economy. It has led to severe energy crisis in Europe that is sharply increasing the cost of living in that continent, hampering their economic activity. Gas prices in Europe have increased more than fourfold since 2021, with Russia cutting deliveries to less than 20% what it was in 2021. The conflict has also pushed up food prices on the world markets, despite the recent easing by the Black Sea grain deal. Europe, because of its energy dependency, and the least developed countries in sub-Saharan Africa, because of their food dependency, are the most vulnerable. Europe is a region that has typically lower growth trend. What we're seeing here is a combination of slower growth and this exogenous shock on the energy prices. But the food and energy prices are expected to moderate, with the latter in second quarter of 2023. Generally, supply side of recession is manageable. Once you get these situations sorted out, the supply will bounce back as will growth. What worries me is inflation is baking in other sectors, such as services. We haven't seen a decrease in their price level in services yet. Global inflation is forecast to increase before decreasing. It's expected to rise from 4.7% in 21 to 8.8% this year, a rate of higher than what we have seen in decades. The peak in global inflation could happen by the end of 2022, then it's expected to decline 6.5% in 23 and 4.1% in 2024. There's this all talk of deglobalization and all talk of this near-shoring supply chains. These are good for securing the supply chains. However, they're moving the production to more costly locations. And I think these are potent pressures which are going to keep the prices elevated for some time to come. Another threat to global economy is tightening financial conditions. This also weighs in the forecast of slowing global economy. Central banks obviously don't like this inflation. They're going to try to suppress it by increasing the interest rates. Both advanced and emerging countries have largely been tightening their monetary policy. Only a few emerging markets have been easing it. This type of monetary policy should, of course, stay on the course to restore price stability, but a coordinated fiscal policy should aim to alleviate the cost of living pressures while maintaining it aligned with the monetary policy. Overall, risks to global economic outlook remain unusually large. Monetary policy could miscalculate the right stance to reduce inflation. Policy paths in largest economies could continue to diverge, leading to further US dollar appreciation and cross-border tensions. Global tightening in financial conditions could trigger widespread emerging market debt stress. Halting gas supplies to Russia could depress output in Europe. A worsening of China's property sector crisis could spill over to domestic banking sector there and weigh in on countries' growth, with negative cross-border effects on the rest of the world. Central banks around the world are now focused on restoring price stability. The pace of tightening has accelerated sharply. There are risks of both under and over tightening. Under tightening would extend the inflationary expectations and would increase the eventual cost of bringing the inflation down. Over tightening, on the other hand, risks pushing the economy, global economy, into an unnecessarily harsh recession. This over-tightening is more likely to be happen the case if the central banks do not coordinate their activities. Persistent and broadening inflation pressures have triggering a rapid tightening of the monetary conditions alongside a powerful appreciation of the US dollar against other currencies. A lack of coordination across the countries led to US dollar's appreciation. The external environment is already very challenging for emerging countries. The strength of dollar is causing acute challenges, tightening financial conditions and increasing the cost of import goods, particularly energy, which they need desperately to continue growing at the rates they're used to. The dollar now is at its highest level since the early 2000s. As the global economy is headed to stormy waters, financial turmoil may well erupt, prompting investors to seek safe haven investments such as US Treasuries, pushing the dollar even higher. This will push many low-income emerging countries into debt stress. In China, the frequent lockdowns under its zero COVID policy has taken a toll on their economy, especially in the second quarter of this year. Furthermore, the property sector, representing about 20% of the economic activity in China, is rapidly weakening. Given the size of China's economy and its importance for global supply chains, this will weigh heavily on global trade activity. There are some optimistic signs coming from China lately regarding lockdowns. There may be a loosening of some restrictions. Let's hope that is the case. One thing that could alleviate all of these risks is a point that I tried to highlight in previous forums. We don't live in this world isolated on our own. To solve global problems, we need multilateral global cooperation and coordination of policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Yenner. Next up is Steve Chinenko.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm going to talk about cryptocurrency. What the heck is it? And is it something we should invest in or not? So we'll talk about what it is, how it works, what need does it meet, or does it meet a need? Regulation, that'll be real quick. Why invest or why not? And then FTX has been in the news so much, so we'll talk about that. So it is digital money. That's the currency portion of the word cryptocurrency. It's not physical. It exists on computers and bits and bytes. That doesn't make it unique. I mean, Chris told us that the Federal Reserve created a whole bunch of money by pressing a key on a keyboard. Most of our money is digital today, not physical. But is cryptocurrency money? First of all, there's a lot of different cryptocurrencies. You've probably heard of Bitcoin. There's 36 others today. Is it an accepted and widespread form of payment? That's part of the definition of money. Not today. Is it a store of value? Not today. And does society trust its value? Definitely not where we are today. What makes it different? What's the crypto part of the word cryptocurrency? All the transactions are encrypted. That's where crypto comes from. It's decentralized. It's not controlled by a government or a central bank, and there's no centralized record keeper. So how does that work? something called blockchain technology. All the data is on every computer in the cryptocurrency network. It's a public ledger. It may be anonymous, may be highly anonymous, may not be anonymous at all, depending on the particular currency, and a permanent record. So I won't take you through the flow chart of how it works, but we'll talk about it for a minute. Well, as I said, all the transactions are encrypted, and every computer on the network must agree for a transaction to be completed. For a transaction to be completed, it has to be decrypted. So somebody's computer has to solve a complex mathematical or computer problem to decrypt the transaction. That costs a lot of money. People aren't going to do that for free, so they get compensated, either with a new Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency, or by fees. That's what crypto mining is, if you've heard of crypto mining. You solve these problems so that transactions can be completed, and you get paid for solving the problem. So that makes it secure. Every computer on the network has to agree, so you can't just go into one bank and hack it, because they all have to agree. It avoids a middleman. That makes things cheaper, usually. No bank, no credit card processor, etc. Creates a record. So it's faster, it's cheaper, it's global, and it's border free, and we'll come back to that later. That's not an unimportant thing. But we're talking about how it works. We're talking about blockchain. Blockchain is a technology. Blockchain is not cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency uses the technology of blockchain. They are created out of thin air, so what are they worth? Well, the value of a cryptocurrency is dependent on confidence in cryptocurrency generally, and in that currency specifically. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of confidence in those things today. Regulation. This is the easiest slide I ever made in my career. Here are the major regulations of cryptocurrency, and as you can see, it's blank. That will change, but that's not where we are today. So if you're going to invest in it, there should be a thesis. There should be a rationale. Why would you invest in a cryptocurrency? So I think there are 4 theses out there, right? One is its value as a payment system, which is really more blockchain technology than a particular cryptocurrency. One is the returns are uncorrelated. They diversify your portfolio. Investors like diversification. Scarcity is a thesis, and black markets is a thesis that you should not follow, but proponents do actually articulate that as a thesis. So we'll talk about these. We talked a lot about a payment system already. It's secure, it avoids the middleman, it's global, it's border free. But that doesn't necessarily mean it should create demand for any particular Bitcoin. As I said, there's 37. So a payment system doesn't create demand for Bitcoin or any other specific cryptocurrency. So it seems to me that if you like cryptocurrency as a payment system, you would want to use some cryptocurrency that has a stable value. So it's always worth the same. Let's say one crypto coin is worth $1, and it's always worth $1. That would ease payment if payment is your thesis. And that's been tried, and you can see the red line. And for a few months, it worked. It was pegged. This stable coin called Terra was equal to $1 for a few months until it wasn't. And then it was worth very suddenly less than 4 cents. So how did they maintain this stability, or how did they tell us they were going to maintain the stability of Terra to $1? They weren't holding $1 for every Terra coin that was out there. Nobody has that kind of money. So there was some kind of an algorithm, like, you know, when Netflix tells you what movie you're going to like, or Amazon says you bought that, you might want to buy this. They created some sort of algorithm. There was nothing real behind that algorithm. People figured that out. Other things were going on in the cryptocurrency market, and so now it's worth less than 4 cents. So that didn't seem to work out very well. Uncorrelated returns. These crypto coins are all highly volatile. The correlation to stocks is not stable. Sometimes it's fairly strong, sometimes it's highly negative and very weak. But you still need an investment thesis. I could go to a casino and I guarantee you my returns would not be correlated to the stock market. But I would always lose money. That's not something I want to invest in, even if it is not correlated. So I don't think this is a very valid thesis either. Or then I'll go again. These are all theses that proponents of crypto coins will tell you why it's a good investment. Scarcity, this is the one I hear the most, and when I work with students, I hear this one a lot. They say, well, the supply is limited, so therefore it's going to go up in value. A coin must be mined, as we talked about. Many coins set a maximum number to be issued. Bitcoin says only 21 million coins. We're not going to have any more than that. We'll probably reach that in 2140. I'm not sure how that math works. There's almost 19 million today, but that's what they say. So supply is limited, so prices should rise. But there has to be demand for price to rise. I can think of a lot of scarce things today that don't have a lot of value. Remember rotary phones? Right? Remember photographic film that you put in a camera? Those things are all pretty scarce today, but they don't have a lot of value. Buggy whips, I mean, maybe as collectibles, but there has to be demand for scarce supply to create value. And is the supply really limited? New cryptocurrencies are being created all the time. And I said at the beginning, they're created out of thin air. Many of them are created split off from other cryptocurrencies that limit how much they will be issued. So I said there's only, I think, 21 million Bitcoin ever going to be issued. A number of cryptocurrencies have been split off from Bitcoin to get around that limitation. So is the supply really limited when anybody can come along and create another one that's just as good as the one that already exists? Now, if you get one, just for the other side, if you get one that becomes the network effect, right? Like you think of Facebook, there could be more than one social network. But if you want to find your high school friends, you're probably going to find them on Facebook. So that's the social network you're going to use. So if one crypto coin became the standard that everybody was using and everybody was using it for payments, that could generate some unique value to that crypto coin, even though there are a whole bunch of others that can be created at any time. So it's possible that could develop, but scarcity without that, and scarcity today, or as I can see looking forward, I don't think we really have scarcity of coins because new ones easily created all the time. It's 30, as I said, there's 37 active ones. Scarcity is another way to say, without talking about the demand side, sort of the fear of missing out, the bigger idiot theory, the greater fool theory. Well, somebody will buy it, it's been going up, and somebody will buy it from me because it's going to keep going up, is a thesis. Bill Gates knows a lot about technology, and he says that, cryptocurrency is 100% based on some sort of greater fool theory. Jamie Dimon, the chairman of CEO of JP Chase, the biggest bank in the country, he knows a lot about finance, and he says that cryptocurrency is a decentralized Ponzi scheme. So those are two people that probably carry more weight than what I say to you here today. But I got to tell you, JP Morgan has a research piece out there saying that Bitcoin has upside. So Jamie Dimon's firm covers Bitcoin and speculates about where it's going. I said black markets was an articulated, stated investment rationale for this, and that's, I said global, it was important. The currency is unregulated. It's used and in many cases relied upon by ransomware criminals, money launderers, illegal gamblers, tax evaders. This is actually the best, might be immoral, but the thesis that makes more sense than in any other thesis. But again, it doesn't have to be any one cryptocurrency. If you are subject to ransomware, and I hope none of you have been or ever will be, you will probably be asked to pay in some crypto coin. That's how ransomware usually works. The US government is the largest single holder of cryptocurrency in the world. Not because they buy cryptocurrency, but because it's not completely anonymous. And when they go out and collect it from criminals, they hold cryptocurrency. So they've accumulated, not a lot, it's less than 1% of the total amount of cryptocurrency, but it's more than anybody else because they go and they get it from criminals. So it's very actively used by criminals. FTX, when we decided that this would be a good topic for today, it was before FTX hit the news. But I figured it's been in the news so much, I have to cover it. It was an unregulated, just like everything else, exchange headquartered in the Bahamas. It was a total fraud. It had 3 directors. 2 of them were internal executive directors. It had an unknown accounting firm, Prager Metis. Maybe some of you know that. I apologize. It was a legitimate accounting firm, but very small, and certainly unknown. So it wasn't quite as bad as Bernie Madoff, who owned and created his own accounting firm, but close. They held customer funds. At one time, they claimed that the customer funds they held were FDIC insured. So that they didn't get away for that for very long, but they didn't get shut down either after making that statement. The funds were not segregated. They were misused by the founder CEO. FTX took on substantial debt using its affiliated crypto coin as collateral. The world eventually figured that out, and was worth $3 billion, ended up being worth, I don't know, $300,000 or something like that. So, I think the technology behind cryptocurrency, blockchain, is valuable as a payments and a transaction system. The Pentagon is looking into using it for controlling weapons systems. So it's a valuable technology, but as a financial asset or an investment, it really lacks a compelling thesis, at least in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And now we can proceed with some Q&A. Rob is going to go ahead. He's our Sergeant at Arms, Emeritus, former president. Okay, question for Steve. What are the long-term ramifications of the FTX scandal on cryptocurrency?
Well, I think we're lucky in the sense that cryptocurrency is not terribly integrated with the rest of the economy and the financial system. So we're not going to see the kind of contagion that we saw, for example, from the collapse in housing during the Great Recession. I think trust is the most important thing in business and certainly the most important thing in finance. And this sets that back a long, long ways. And I think we will see regulation. We'll see regulation coming out of the US and probably coming out of Europe, certainly fairly quickly as well. In terms of what that means for the long-term outcome of cryptocurrency, again, without seeing an investment thesis, it's hard for me to sort of understand where it goes anyhow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. This is a question this would be a good question for the entire panel. Well, why don't we just go ahead and give this to Chris? Why are central banks worldwide stockpiling gold at such high levels at this moment?
Yeah, I have to say, I don't know. I hadn't heard that. So I guess I'll have to pass on that one.
Okay. Yenner, any ideas?
They are or they are not?
They are. Mm-hmm.
They are.
I guess that sort of answers me too. Like I don't know that they were. So
Okay.
I mean that's a lingering effect of a financial system we used to have years ago. So there's no reason for central banks to.
Exactly, and I've heard a lot about that, but not the reasoning why they're hoarding gold.
Well, let's hope they're not hoarding gold to buy cryptocurrency.
Okay. Now this is a question for the entire panel. When do you anticipate the dollar losing its status as the world's reserve currency? Yenner, do you want to start?
I don't think it will happen anytime soon. I mean, US dollar used to be the central currency in the Bretton Woods system. That was a system that collapsed in early 70s, and it's been 50 years, and it's still being used as a vehicle currency in a lot of the international transactions. And for that, we need to have a replacement, and I don't see any currency having the stability, independence that would replace the US dollar.
Anybody else? Or
No, I agree. The question is what would the world use instead? And it's like they say, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is the king, and I think that's a good summary of the US dollar. So sure, the US dollar has its issues, but what would people use? The euro, the Chinese yuan, the Japanese yen, like all those seem like worse options. So assuming nothing better comes along, I think people are kind of stuck with the dollar, which is why the dollar has appreciated substantially against world currencies following the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates for the second half of 2022.
I've heard one theory, though, is that half, they're saying there could be a dichotomy, okay, where there's the US and the US side, okay, and then there's the Saudi, okay, and the Chinese, okay, and they're pushing back and forth, trying to go ahead and provide an alternative, both in currency as well as other issues. Or is that just gamesmanship?
Oh, you read about how the Russians are demanding payment in rubles for Russian oil. So I suppose if you're a country, you could demand payment of your own currency for something that people want to buy. But for all other transactions, there would have to be a compelling case for private individuals to use a different currency rather than the US dollar. And, given the status of the other economies around the world of their currencies, I think it'd be a tough sell for people to switch away from the dollar. And I would not recommend switching to cryptocurrency either.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. The next question is, after the Civil War, formerly enslaved people never got their promised 40 acres and a mule. Slave owners were the only ones paid reparations. Today, the racial wealth gap is bigger than when Martin Luther King died. What economic policies would help close the racial wealth gap? I'll just throw this open to the panel.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, that's one of those questions, if you knew the answer to, there's probably a Nobel Prize in there. So if you know the answer to that, that's $1 million plus the chance to meet the King of Sweden to get a medal. So I guess my best solution would be like policies that promote the overall well-being of the national economy will promote the economic well-being of those least worst, or those least well off, the worst off among us. So perhaps that's racial minorities, or perhaps it's just low-income people in general. But what you've seen during the pandemic is some solid years of wage growth at the low end are totally wiped out by the shutdowns, which hit the lower side of the labor market the hardest. Because you think about where the shutdowns happen, it was restaurants, bars, entertainment venues, hotels, places where lower wage workers work. The people who were less affected were the so-called laptop class, where you could take your laptop home, work from home in your pajamas, and you still got a stimulus check, even though you kept your job and didn't suffer a loss of income. So if anything, pandemic policies have really made the so-called racial wealth gap worse, but I would call it the wealth gap between lower income people and upper income people. So just stopping policies that are completely counterproductive, I think, would be a good first step.
Thank you. Question for you.
One thing that I could add, maybe, Jack, I think a reform in the education system may be the answer for that one, making the, high school education, K-12 education, feasible and university degrees more accessible would certainly help, in my opinion.
Okay. And this is a question for Yenner. What are some ways or examples to have multicultural global policies to bring down inflation globally and domestically?
I think, coordination certainly helps. The central banks, when they're deciding on the interest rates, they need to coordinate their policies so that it can be much more effective. That there is the role of a central bank in one country has been diminished because there's a lot more activity done by multinationals and others. And but if they are all coordinating at the same time, I think it will have much more bigger impact on inflation.
Thank you. I suspect this is probably a question that Chris might want to address. How do you feel about the hyperinflation that's taking place in the construction industry due to the passing of the infrastructure bill? Due to this, what is the true return on dollars invested in real estate, supply shortages, lack of skilled labor, and other material shortages?
Yeah, so construction costs have really skyrocketed during the pandemic for a variety of reasons. One, labor market shortages, which lots of industries are facing. That's one reason why food prices are up, as an example. You look at agriculture, they're facing labor market shortages plus increasing costs for fertilizer. Russia is a big supplier of the world's fertilizer supply, so when that supply gets disrupted, it causes food prices to spike. Plus diesel fuel, farmers are paying $5 to $6 per gallon for diesel fuel, and it takes a lot of diesel fuel to farm. I know the question asked about construction, but I think farming is a good illustration about what the pandemic, the policies put in place to address the pandemic, plus the Russian-Ukrainian war doing to individual industries. And I think construction is very similar. Labor market shortages, like I said, lumber famously skyrocketed in price. You go to Home Depot and pay $10 for a 2x4 stud. They used to cost a couple bucks before the pandemic. Lumber prices are coming back down again, but there are other costs that are up as well, as the question indicates. And I think the short answer is that you're going to get less bang for your buck in general. Things you thought were going to cost X to do are going to cost 2X. So promises made in terms of what would be repaired for the infrastructure bill are going to be, like a previous question said, not realized. So I think it's just a dollar's not going to go as far, building things, growing things. And the question is how long does it take for those disruptions to get ironed out? It just seems like as time goes on, it's just taking longer and longer for things to kind of settle back down to normal.
I'm going to toss this question over to Steve, though then the panel perhaps might want to join in. Do you think that some of the inflation we are seeing could be artificial, meaning businesses are raising prices for their own goods or services because everyone else is raising their prices? Could some of this be fed by greed?
I don't know why we have greed now. We didn't have it 1 year ago and 2 years ago and 4 years ago and 5 years ago in terms of the business community. Business exists to create profits, and I don't know why all of a sudden they decided to create profits if they could have been creating them before.
Yeah, you always hear that whenever there's inflation, people say it's because of greed. But like Steve said, if it's greed that costs gas to hit $5 per gallon on Memorial Day, I assume the oil companies are just as greedy now as what they were in 2019. So at Memorial Day 2019, why was it gasoline $5 per gallon? So the goal of a business is to maximize profit. But you maximize profit in the framework of a market, supply and demand. And if supply is disrupted, which it is in the oil market, which it is in the food market, like I discussed, labor market shortages, fertilizer shortages, feed prices are up by close to 100% for livestock feed. That's going to get passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices because most businesses are not high margin business. If you're running a farm, you might be looking at like a 4 or 5% profit margin. Agriculture is very competitive. Really all other industries of the economy are really competitive. The grocery stores are very competitive. So if one grocery store wakes up one day and says, well, we're going to be greedy at double prices, well, consumers will just shop at a different grocery store. So it's market competition that keeps prices in check. And I don't think the markets have been any less competitive now compared to in 2019. You don't see big market consolidation in industries in 2022, where you're seeing prices rise that did not already exist in 2019. I tend to think that the government likes to blame greed for inflation because it deflects the blame from the real cause of inflation, which is increasing the money supply to finance irresponsible government spending. I mean, if you want to know, that's what Milton Friedman said we addressed the American Economic Association, I think is in 1968. Inflation is created in Washington, D.C., because that's where the printing presses are. That's where spending is set and passed. It really comes down to that. If we didn't see $5 trillion in COVID stimulus spending, inflation would still be at 2%.
I don't think it's greed either. I grew up in a country where the inflation rate was 60%. So you build that expectation when you're pricing your salaries, your whatever you're selling. So you need to be able to lower the inflationary expectation, and that comes with independence of central bank from the influences of the governments.
Question for Chris. What is the impact of COVID on Social Security insolvency?
Yeah, it's pushed it up a couple of years. I know the most recent Social Security trustees report was released recently. I did take a close look at it to see how the insolvency date was pushed up compared to previous years, but I think it's a couple of years earlier than what it was a couple of years ago, because what happens is when the economy hits a recession, wages fall, and since Social Security is funded by the FICA payroll tax, if wages fall, payroll tax collections fall, so that brings in less revenue, and then people who are at Social Security age but perhaps working and not collecting Social Security retire and begin collecting benefits. So when there's a recession, tax revenues fall, benefit payouts increase, which pushes up the insolvency date. So I believe the insolvency date is 2034-ish, which is surprisingly not that far away. You're talking 11 years from now. But what insolvency means is not that Social Security checks will just stop, because the way Social Security works, it's basically a Ponzi scheme. Current investors are paying the current beneficiaries. The current investor is someone who's working. So when you pay the Social Security tax, that goes directly to someone who's collecting Social Security, like my parents are. So even in 2034, there'll be people working paying the payroll tax, which means benefits will be paid out. Insolvency just says, well, the benefits that have been promised won't be paid out because tax collections will be insufficient to pay out those promised benefits, which means when insolvency hits, benefits will fall by about 30%, and that payroll tax collections will be able to pay out about 70% of what's been promised. Will there be an automatic 30% benefit cut when that happens? I'm fairly skeptical, because I think there'd be massive political pushback if Social Security recipients like my parents saw their check get 30% lighter when insolvency happens. So I think what happens is the federal government, just the Congress and the president, just decide, well, hey, we're going to continue to pay out all the benefits that were promised. Now the shortfall just get tacked onto the national debt like everything else.
And then last question. Again, I think we kind of addressed this when we're looking at the US dollar being the world currency of choice, but question again is in this vein: how worried should we be about the gold-backed new currency that China and Russia are creating? How will it affect the United States?
I think in both of these countries, the currencies are significantly influenced by their governments. I don't think that the world would have any confidence in a currency where the governments may decide, and then that will have an impact on the value of those currencies. So I don't think that I would be worried at all.
But if it did happen, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that wouldn't be good, right?
Probably not.
Okay. We do have a few questions that are left over. Many of these will appear on my final exam next week. At this point, I'd really like to thank a variety of people for their dedication and help in pulling off this event. First of all, our former dean, Anil Mishra, was very instrumental in helping start this. I worked with him in the spring, and he was very enthusiastic. He said, yes, let's go live, let's go ahead and get it back in the North Bank. So Anil, thank you very much. And then Yenner, our interim dean, joined in, and he's not only bankrolled a lot of things here, but he was involved, as President Elizabeth might attest to, he was involved with getting all the technology and all the pieces to work seamlessly. So thank you, Yenner. Amy Vanderpoot, of course, from Rotary, is always there piecing everything together. Kristen Orntz was really great this year. So again, a lot of people involved with this. And then finally, I'd like to thank the food service and wait staff. Let's give them a round of applause. Okay, thank you very much. And I'll turn over the microphone to President Elizabeth.
All right, thank you so much, Jack, and I will echo those words of appreciation for everybody who came today and who had a hand in putting this together, all the preparations, the assistance on the technology side, just all tremendous. So this forum, I certainly always learn a lot from it each time. I'm coming away with a lot of additional thoughts, new questions to mull over. I hope that you found it equally enjoyable and enlightening. And that you'll come back next year for another in-person Economic Forum event. I want to thank our hosts at the School of Management for the University of Michigan-Flint. And on behalf of the Rotary Club of Flint, we wish all of you a very safe, healthy, and happy holiday season. And we wish you the very best for a prosperous new year. And with that, we stand adjourned. Thank you.